Hi, welcome to Making Sense of Complexity, featuring conversations with complexity science practitioners and philosophers. Our goal is to share insights on how to make sense of our complex and uncertain world. Today our guest is Bleu Knight, an independent consultant with broad experience in neurobiology, predictive analytics, bioinformatics, complexity science, yoga, meditation, and art. A co-organizer of the Complexity Weekend Community of Practice and the Active Inference Lab, Bleu has a very broad range of experience and interests and seeks to integrate these interests into a balanced life. Let's begin.
Hi, Bleu. Nice to see you again.
Hi, George. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Thanks for joining me. And where are you calling in from today?
I am in sunny, beautiful Las Cruces, New Mexico.
That sounds great. Yeah, it's a sunny day here in Concord, Massachusetts as well, but a little bit warm, unseasonably so, I think. I understand you had some fires earlier in the year. Has that all calmed down?
We've had, since the fire, excessive rain for like 3 months, more rain than I've ever seen in the 20 years I've lived here.
So, 1 in a 1,000-year fires followed by 1 in a 1,000-year floods. These are crazy times. They are. Well, I'm glad to see it sounds like you're doing well right now, so that's good. Sunny day. So, Bleu, tell me a little bit about your background and what got you into complexity science.
So I have a PhD in cellular and molecular neuroscience, and when I was doing my doctorate, I was looking at how neural cells differentiate and they become neurons and they become glia. And this was kind of my PhD work, and I really found not two distinct bucket of cells. I found a bucket that was like a continuous bucket. Like I didn't find neurons and glia. I found something along a continuum. And that really goes against the grain, the traditional like background in neuroscience. And so I looked into what people do when a problem is more complicated than the field thinks. So there's like a very reductionist level thinking in neuroscience that everything kind of has to be this way and follow a certain standard. And when I looked into that, I came across complexity science and the Santa Fe Institute and applied to go to the complex systems summer school there. And so that was like the summer right before I defended my dissertation. I was there at the Santa Fe Institute and kind of have been studying complexity, working in complexity, exploring complexity ever since.
So did that introduction to complexity help you gain some perspective on the problem you had been seeing in your neuroscience work?
No. I mean, a little bit. So, I mean, and I had studied systems biology before, but it really didn't give me anything new, but it completely derailed my research interests, which was awesome, actually. Like, it's nice to just have your whole life upended and be presented with a whole new set of tools to solve challenges that you've always been thinking about. Like, so I had new tools to think about in neuroscience, and I had new tools to think about all problems with after, the complex system summer school, and just a new network of people to explore research problems and questions and have fun with.
Well, let's go back a little bit because you use the word reductionist, which I guess is sometimes applied to what might be called old science. The idea that you break everything apart, look at the components, and figure out how it works. So, so let's talk about neuroscience again. I guess you said the conventional idea was that a neural type cell, early in its stages will differentiate and it'll become either a neuron or a glial cell, something like that?
Yeah.
And what's the difference between those two kinds of cells?
So in the traditional, like old standing classical perspective of neuroscience, the neurons do all of the electrical signaling and have all of the, like, they're the stars of the show. And the glia is kind of more like the supporting cast role. So really, we've come to know that glia also do electrical signaling, but it's just very different than the classic action potential that a neuron does. So, there's huge differences. They play different roles, just like your heart cells and your lung cells. There are differences. They have different functions, but both are necessary for the brain to survive. So it's not like you can have a glia-free existence or a glia-free brain. Those don't happen. So.
And what was your PhD work on? What was that? What was that work that you did?
So I looked at human astrocytes. So this was kind of like the start of the project. Was I looked at human embryonic astrocytes and I cultured them, and I cultured them in different conditions. I cultured them in a flat plastic monolayer, like you would normally see on the in a tissue culture dish, and then I also like laid them on some hydrogel material that kind of has the consistency of jello. And so like I put this layer of jello down at the bottom of the flask and then put the cells in. And so when I added this hydrogel layer, I really saw a huge difference in morphology of the astrocytes. So these are normal human astrocytes. And then I put them in the hydrogel and they started to look like neurons. They started to develop these like long extension processes and stuff. And I was like, whoa, like can astrocytes change into neurons? Is this possible? And like, I didn't add any growth factors or I didn't do anything. And it wasn't matrigel. So like matrigel has a ton of growth factors in it that can do weird things to your cultures. And that's a classic hydrogel. But this is just a chemically defined 16-mer self-assembling polypeptide monomer. And so like I knew exactly what was in my chemically defined hydrogel. And so it appeared that the stiffness of the surface or of the culture media or having multiple dimensions to cross maybe affected the change. And so then I went on to look at gene expression and I did RNA sequencing work. And then I looked at not astrocytes, but I looked at like a neural precursor stem cell and I differentiated those in different conditions. And I looked at tubulin expression. And so how different markers are expressed inside cells tends to like lead the field to say, oh, that's a neuron because it expresses XYZ protein, or it can't express XYZ protein because it's a neuron, right? But I really found a great deal of variety when looking at markers and looking at genes that were expressed in the neurons and the astrocytes, like things that shouldn't be there were there. And I mean, it just was all a fuzzy gray area, not a bucket of neurons and a bucket of glia.
So that process of how a stem cell moves into the role that it plays in the brain is sounds like it's more complicated than people want to think it is.
Well, I don't think that we understand it at all. Like, I still don't think, I mean, I think it's so complicated that people know that they have a long way to go generally. But just even the process of existing, not just becoming, but existing as a cell in the brain, existing as a glial cell or existing as a neural cell. I think that is more complicated than people or more complex than people like to think.
Yeah, so I think the people may have heard about how complex the brain is, and it has something like what 100 billion neurons. Do I have that right? 100 billion neurons, which is more than 10 times more than there are human beings on the face of the earth, and they've all got these connections, and they're a giant network, and so that's pretty complex, even just thinking about neurons connecting. But now, the way these different pieces of the brain are interacting is also quite complicated. Nobody really understands it.
I mean, we have insight and we understand parts of what are happening at any snapshot, but like all we could actually do is take a snapshot. And so that kind of is maybe what contributes to this reductionist way of thinking, especially in the human brain. Like I can't look inside the human brain. I can't actually like cut it up and figure out what's going on or what the effects of a drug are or any of these things because no one's signing up to guinea pig, right? So I can only look at a piece. And so, I was just looking at cells growing in culture as opposed to like a living animal. And, there are ways, but all we can do is just get glimpses of what's actually happening. It's like as soon as you start to take apart a cat to figure out what makes a cat purr, it stops being a cat. It's not going to purr at that point, right? So like
Right.
you can't actually get to the root of what you're trying to solve because you are dismembering the system.
Yeah, and when you dismember it, you may see some stuff, but you won't see the thing working together.
Exactly.
That reminds me of I remember learning that there was once a time when people talked about the electrical signals in the brain and it all drives everything. And and there's about 90% of the brain that does stuff that they couldn't figure out what it was electrically, and so they called it, they called it noise. We have all this electrical noise in the brain, and that was just because people didn't know what it did, right? And so, from a reductionist standpoint, if you can't figure out what something is doing, you just say, "Oh well, that's just noise or junk." So you have a different perspective now on the complexity of how the brain works, and so you said that your move into complexity science was something that you really enjoyed, different tools, different challenges, but it didn't necessarily solve those problems you were looking at in neuroscience, or at least not yet. Is that right?
Yeah, but it just presents a new way to look at problems, and to realize that you might not be seeing the whole thing. It's like the elephant, you're feeling the trunk, you're feeling the leg, you're feeling the body, and so all the parts feel different. That's how we solve problems. And that maybe leads to the reductionist view, because like all you can actually categorize is the piece that you're working on. But panning out, we can, draw some larger conclusions, and we do see the intricacy and interconnectedness of all the different pieces. Although we can't maybe provide a detailed explanation for those things, we know that more is going on at a bigger scale than maybe what we would like to assume.
So it sounds like the Santa Fe Institute is a very different kind of environment than the traditional academic process, right?
Well, yes and no. I mean, my PhD advisor was trained in biophysics, and so I really kind of was already at this very interdisciplinary, like physics, biology, chemistry. I liked working across these fields, even engineering. So I had many different collaborators, like throughout my undergrad and PhD. So I was working in a very interdisciplinary way already. So that wasn't new for me, and that sometimes is the biggest barrier for people coming into complexity, is the interdisciplinarity of it all.
Mm-hmm.
So that was kind of already old hat.
Mm-hmm.
Just the the tools for analysis, I think, were the most fun and maybe most revolutionary for me, like multi-layer network analysis and different things like that. So it just was looking at nonlinear dynamics and those things. So
I want to go back for a second and ask you to, I'm old school, right? So biology, chemistry, physics are all separate disciplines. What exactly is biophysics?
So great question. And that's a field, like, I'm still working there now. So it's like when you look at physical properties, that, like, my PhD research is a perfect example about using a hydrogel substrate. Like the Young's modulus of the hydrogel is very different than the Young's modulus of a plastic dish. And so it's how these physical, yes.
What is the Young modulus?
So as a physicist, I thought you would know that one. The Young's modulus is just a measure of the elasticity of a substrate. So when you are looking at like how elastic it is, and like we know the difference between soft and hard, right? Like, so that's something we can judge, but it's like the bounciness or the spring backable backableness. That sounds so scientific, but yeah. So it's the elasticity measurement, and that matters for a lot of things. Like if you drop a glass onto a concrete surface from 6 feet above, it's going to break. If you drop it onto a trampoline, maybe it'll break, but maybe not. So
yeah, so the physical characteristics of the substrate in the case of the hydrogel or whatever is important in terms of determining the behavior of the evolution of those cells.
Exactly, because we all operate within the laws of physics.
Yeah.
All
and
of
so
evolution.
would another one be something like, the mysteries of protein folding? Proteins, we didn't used to know how they work, but then we figured out it has something to do with the shape they assume, and certain configurations actually will end up, triggering certain other reactions. And so the physical shape of a protein is an important part of how it functions. Is that an example of a similar idea?
So actually, biochemistry, I think, took that over. So I don't know
Okay.
that.
Okay. Wrong field.
I don't know that biophysics. I mean, it does definitely. It has a role, right? Like the protein folding, like the protein conformation, definitely plays a role, like in whether an enzyme is going to function or not, or whether a viral protein is going to still be active or not, or produce the right antigen suppressant molecule. So definitely, like it is physics, but I think like what people assume for like or they characterize as mine, like this is part of my field. Like I don't know that biophysics claims that one, but like right now I'm doing a lot of different a lot of work with the atomic force microscopy, and so like there's a lot of things like when you want to like look and deform like how like pliable and it's those like material properties. So let me like think of another um, example. Oh, so microscopy is actually huge biophysics, right? Like so like that's like something that like the physicists own the microscopes, but like unless they're functional for the biologists. So that's like a good example like of like all
Hmm.
microscopy, laser scan and confocal and different kinds of microscopy. Like the people that really do microscopy, they're in biophysics. And so like I think biochemistry adopted the protein folding stuff because while it is physics, definitely I'm not going to deny that. I think it's um, not been adopted by that field. And like coming from neuroscience and now working in active inference, it's like I'm also in like active inference is not neuroscience. Like that, it's just
Right.
not. It's like
Right.
cognitive. It's cognitive science. So there used to be like I don't know, like so psychology, neuroscience, cognitive science, like they all do different things. It's all very like who claims what, but I mean, yeah, it's all brain science, right? So
Right, and different terminology, different tools, different techniques, different ways of thinking about things. It sort of shapes the inquiry. But it sounds like you're interested in kind of, well, let's just cut through all that. And, I mean, Santa Fe Institute tried cross-cutting ways of looking, different ways of looking at things. So I wanted to ask you about that. You talked about the tools that you learned at Santa Fe Institute really inspiring you. And so talk about that a little bit. What kinds of tools could you point to that the average person will be able to make sense of?
So like network analysis is probably the biggest one,
Okay.
the one that I use the
Yeah.
most. And really like information theory and like looking at information flow in networks. Like I kind of, that's like, I like that little spot. Right.
Right.
So that was like my favorite, I think like tool that I learned about in, at the Santa Fe Institute, and like learned about it even more after that. So that
Hmm.
that kind of was my favorite. But there are many tools, and it's not just the tool; it's also using the tools like for something totally new. So like can you look at network analysis for um, both like gene networks, but also like social networks. So that like there's a sociological component and just the application across many fields of a tool
Hmm.
that like belongs primarily used to be this field, but now we use
Hmm.
it everywhere. So these
Hmm.
kinds of things.
So let's talk a little bit about network analysis. Down at the very basic level, you have different entities, for example, in a population or sample, and I think the conventional way of thinking about these things is distinct into entities, and reductionism would kind of break them down and look at the entity. But networks are looking at the interactions of those entities and sort of explain to me sort of how you begin to approach that kind of, like what are, they're called nodes and edges, I think, in network science.
Right. And so nodes and edges. I wasn't really ready to give a lecture on network science, but I think about it like the electrical grid, right? So
Yeah.
really like that's the simplest, easiest way for me to think about it, really. So and especially about transmission in a network when you think about how things flow. So everybody, there's power produced at different places. So there's power hub, power hub, power hub, power hub. But somehow that power needs to all connect and power everyone in the grid. And like the
Hmm.
grids are removed. So there's like, the Southwest grid, the Northeast grid. I mean, there's many, I don't know all the ins and outs of the grids,
Hmm.
but, but when you think about the network, so each node would then be like either a source of electricity or a sink of
Hmm.
electricity, even though like at the source, you also require power. But so, and there's the edges are literally the power lines that connect those things.
Yeah. Yeah. So, by the way, I used to work in the utility industry. You just did great. So, so edges, nodes, and the flows between them, and that's a way of thinking about, can be applied to a lot of different kinds of systems, right? It's what you were saying: biology, chemistry, electrical grids, people, right? So what is it about networks? Is it kind of like thinking in an abstract sense? Let's not look at specifics. Let's sort of back up and take a look at how this network is interacting, right? So how would you think about that?
So for me, like the interactions in the network are definitely interesting, and how like things move between the nodes in the network, and how to quantify that kind of thing, like the current, that's flowing through the electrical wire. But more than that, so what I really, you know, what really like made me love it was like the fact that yes, we have a network of electrical nodes, either sources or sinks, and we also have a network of edges connecting them. But like those sources or sinks also contain like their own network within them. So like within a house, there like there's no source of electricity in a house, or maybe there is if you have a solar panel. So like maybe you have your own source within your house. You have your own little source, and then you have many different sinks. Like so, where the electricity is going in your house, like to power my computer, my monitor, my headset, like all these different things, the air conditioning. And so there's a network of networks of networks of networks, and I just like that just does it for me. It just really, I love like and this is what I love about complexity is the scaling between different hierarchical levels, like within a system, and how information flows, is passed upward, is kind of concretized. Like my brain says I'm thirsty, but like my brain didn't directly receive a message from like every single cell in my body that says I don't have enough water. Like so there's the information is concentrated somehow, and like how does that go like from the atomic level to the cellular level to the tissue, organism, and then like even like to the family, to the environment, like to your own community, to like the ecosystem, all the other types of organisms that you interact with. So for me, like that really kind of being able to like just even have a lens into how things scale in a hierarchical way, like just is like mwah, perfect, love it.
Yeah. And I know one of the books up here is Geoffrey West's Scale, which deals with a lot of that stuff, how the interactions of cells, the interactions of people, the interactions of cities, are all have similar network characteristics, right? So what are some of the things that we find in networks when we look at them in that generalized way?
Well, I mean, you find like hubs where like, they're like super spreaders for a virus, for instance. And so you find like, places that have a lot of connections. Or also like you find like isolated pockets. And so it's like you can look at different networks. You can do community detection. You can, analyze things in different ways. So.
So there are tools that are used in network analysis then that can be applied not just to biology but also to social science, and one of the phrases that comes up is about networks is scale free. What is a scale free designation for a network?
So the scale free network is the like I'm trying to think. Like there's it's a non-regular network, right? The scale-free designation, I think, is what like that means, as opposed to like something that's very regular.
But you see that pattern, for example, in networks across a variety of different fields. So it's thinking about networks and things like, the scaling of that network. I'm remembering one now in terms of metabolism, right? There's a famous study about metabolism in animals, and they get bigger, their metabolism has to slow down, and they get smaller, and the metabolism speeds up. And there's the heartbeat thing, and that scale applies to that calculation. And and says that, well, there's a relationship between size and metabolism. So that's an example of a network that has a pattern to it that can then be analyzed and studied and used for predictions, right?
Well, so it's the scale-free network is like it's a highly connected network is what it is. So like what it's as opposed to like a sparse network where like those are not as amenable to like mathematical analysis of any form because you can't divide by zero, like long story short. So
Yep.
like where there's no connection between the different nodes, that's a harder network to do any kind of analysis on. So the scale-free is not like it's not regular. It's not like a regularized. It's not a fully connect. Is a fully connected network a scale-free network? I don't know. I don't know honestly. But
But that's one of those questions that thinking about things in terms of networks, you can see. You know, we've got 8 billion humans, and that means their interconnections act in a certain way. And you know, we've all heard the 6 degrees of separation kind of analysis. So there'd be a similar calculation for any network. You know, how long does it take to get from one point to another in a network? And
right, and the sparse networks, it doesn't work because it's like, you know, the guy living in the cave is never going to get COVID. Like
right,
it's never
right,
going to
good for
happen.
him.
So
Yeah, and I guess another example, the immune system is one of those sophisticated networks in a given human body, right? That's what I've heard is very complex, lots of connections between the types of cells and the interfaces between, so it can be viewed as a network type response, not just as, you know, individual cells. And
I haven't heard that one. So, but I mean,
okay,
it's been
yeah,
like
yeah.
20 years since I even had a single course in immunology. Biology is so broad. Like I never have taken like any kind of, I've never had a course in evolution, for example. So like when you do, like I'm good inside of a cell. I'm comfortable with protein folding, like biochemistry, but like in a very broad way, like zooming out, that's kind of more like, that's not cell and molecular. It's to like evolution, ecology, which is all fascinating. But it's been a long time since I studied the immune system
Yeah,
and
but that's
ins
an
and
example of how different, you know, a network. We started talking about networks, and now we're talking about all different types of biology. And network analysis also applies to computers and computer networks, and you know,
I'm
the
more
stars in
comfortable
the
with that.
sky. Yeah, or the stars in the sky. So it's an example of a tool, a way of thinking about things that complexity science has uh, worked on that gives you a tool that applies to all sorts of different fields.
Yeah. And like the extraction of a core of a network, I think is also really fascinating because it gives you like the most like prominent nodes in the network, like the essential nodes for transmission. So like that's like if you knock out, you know, one of the power supplies in the electrical grid or knock out even a hub where all the wires are routed through, like if all the wires can't go, then, you know, it's not gonna, there's not going to be a path from A to Z if you
Mm-hmm.
knock something out around M.
Yeah. And there are also in networks, in the operation networks, feedback loops, right? So that's another way that using that network model, you can think about things that, you know, the effect goes out, but then the effects will come back through the network. And that feedback loop is part of the old, the field, I guess, called cybernetics, which was one of the early fields of complexity science, is the way feedbacks and feedback works.
Yeah, and then that's also like in biological networks, and maybe in cybernetics as well. The feedback like gets amplified in a way that's nonlinear. So like just you send out one, you know, transcription factor, and it does a whole lot of things, right? Just that one little molecule of can, you know, have a huge effect, or the
Yeah,
absence of it.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Getting sick is obviously a network effect, a cascading network effect from feedback that's unconstrained, and the process is unconstrained. This is fascinating. So I want to shift gears. We've talked about your neuroscience background, and then went off into networks and complexity science. But you're active in a field and with a laboratory called the Active Inference Lab.
Yeah, not a laboratory in like the, you know, classical sense, but now we're officially actually the Active Inference Institute. So
Oh,
we've just
great.
undergone a 501(c) restructuring and have changed our name to reflect the different activities that we're involved in, including research, education, and others.
So in the academic network, you're stepping up into a bigger node by becoming an institute. That's congratulations.
Thanks.
So,
Thanks.
well, that's great. So explain, like, I don't know anything. Explain what active inference is.
So, active inference is a theory that started out as a theory of cognition and processing information. And now it's widely used in artificial intelligence and can be used to explain behavior, not only cognition, but all behavior that is uh, done in terms of input and output.
Okay, I know what the word inference refers to. It's like, looking for something and making an inference about what would happen if you do this or that or something. And what's the active part, and how does it work give me an example of sort of a way of thinking about active inference.
So active inference is inference is kind of on the perception end. So we think about like the perception and action, and then there's like the states that go into that. So if I want to determine whether a surface is smooth or rough, if I tell you, put your hand on the table and tell me what does the surface feel like? You actually don't know what the surface feels like until you move your hand. So in order to perceive, you must act. Or like what's in the box, you have to open the lid. So action and perception are constantly in feedback with one another.
And is this a way of thinking about things, sort of the biological types of things, or does it apply generally to different kinds of um, objects or things? Or
So it's scale friendly, active inference, and can apply to biological things, which become increasingly complex when think about single cells all the way up to um, organisms. But also like there's mere active inference, which is just like like you could think about input output just of like a computer, a cybernetic system, like a vacuuming robot or something like that. So there's always input output, whether a system can act with agency, which is like, kind of what determines
Mhm.
whether it's a mere active inference entity or like an actual active inference entity.
Right. So
And like
one,
where to draw the line between those two is kind of
mhm.
like, it's always a little fuzzy for me.
Yeah. So an example might be, say, a cell, like a bacteria cell, which is swimming around in its environment. It senses, has a way of sensing or reaching out or sensing, biochemical sensors, what's in the environment, and it will respond to that based upon what it doesn't think, but based upon the mechanics. So it might get a signal that there's food, and it will then embrace uh, and consume the item if it's so. So that's sort of a perception, and then response that's for the benefit of the organism, right? So that's a mini little example of active inference at work in a cell.
Yeah.
Okay. And then you can go from cell to the cells participating in a complex organism, where each
Yes.
cell still has its own little process of sensing and receiving and responding. And now it's all part of this massive network as part of an organism. And the organism is in another sense, at a higher level, sensing and perceiving and acting.
We always think about it like a higher level, but I often wonder, maybe like we're the lower level. So maybe we're just the vehicle that the cells use to drive around and do what they want to do. Who knows?
That would suggest that they have aspirations and desires, and that's an interesting thought.
I don't presume to know that they don't. And, we always kind of start off with inactive inference, which doesn't explain things like self-sacrifice and, you know, uh, uh, negative behavior, but we always kind of assume that cells, bacteria, humans, or all living things want to survive. So like you assume that the underlying drive, even if that's the only drive, is to exist.
So again, I don't know much about immunology, but aren't the T cells the kind that will sense and then self-destruct, destroy the bacteria, but destroy themselves in the process? So is that sort of self?
I don't know.
Yeah, but that's an example of self-sacrifice.
The altruistic behavior. And even you see
Yeah,
it in ants, right? Like, so the ants will, all go inside, and then the last ant left out will plug the hole so the water can't get in, and it'll die in the rainstorm. So like you see that kind of altruistic behavior across the animal kingdom.
right. And it looks altruistic, but it may simply be the combination of chemical stimuli and positional stimuli, and that could result in that behavior without any motive. In sort of the internal motivation, I guess, is what it's kind of getting me to. My mind is a little bit crazy here about the internal motivation that an ant might or might not have in self-sacrificing for the colony, or is it simply just an instinctive response that it does because its stimuli cause it to do that?
So it's super interesting to think about. And like in the same way that the natural killer cells will sacrifice to save, the greater organism, maybe the ant sacrifices to save the nest, or the human sacrifices to save the family or the community. So we all have this kind of self-sacrificing, and maybe we're just cells in like the giant organism of humankind. Maybe we're all just one big living, breathing organism, and we're all just, we have to do our part. So I don't presume to know these things, but it's fun to think about them.
Yeah, that's an exciting way to think about it. All kind of built up in this from one nested network in things into another nested network to another nested network. It kind of gives you a picture of how the whole thing hangs together.
I mean, a muddy picture, but yeah, that's like
very muddy. Very muddy.
It's like one of those. It's a Van Gogh painting.
Yeah,
Nothing's very clear. Don't try to examine it with a magnifying glass. But it's, and that's what I like about the multi-level network analysis also, because it's that's the same kind of hierarchical scaling that is really what I find fascinating.
Yeah, and I think that's an important message from complexity science, is that when you divide things up to look at them and apart, you're maybe missing something important about how they interact. And
definitely,
and that applies. We can think about it in terms of ecology. If you were to look at an ecology by taking a look at the individual pieces and not seeing how they fit together, you're going to miss the whole story. Same thing with the human body. We go to these cells, if they're working together, that's the interesting thing, is how they work together. If you start looking at the cells, you miss that picture. So that's one of the things that complexity science does. It forces us to think about things in a way that's, kind of connects them across scale. That's exciting. That's pretty exciting. Changing gears a little bit. This sounds like, I mean, you were in neuroscience. You pursued that for a period of time. Now you're in complexity science, and it sounds like there are things that aren't easy to answer, right? So, how do you make sense of this stuff that is difficult, uncertain, can't necessarily be answered? The complexity stuff.
So, I mean, we all, like, you can chase down a rabbit hole, right? And like, you can answer, but why, but why, but why, but why, but why, like a 2-year-old. And we all kind of reach the end of the rope and just have to say, well, because. Right? So, I mean, that like would never satisfy me ever. And, I mean, I think we kind of all do it in a different way, maybe, but for me, like when I reach the end of my but why rope, like I turn to like spirituality and like my own spiritual process. So
Yeah, and so let's talk about that a little bit. You have a tradition from your childhood that you've embraced, or has maybe changed over time.
So as a child, was raised like, going to psychic fairs, and I saw an astrologer like every 6 months from birth, and had past life readings, and went to like psychic fairs and did different things like that. So that was kind of a bizarre like new age upbringing. But I became Buddhist at 19. Um, which is kind of like, I guess I can unpack this story for you. I was in art school in Santa Fe, and they took us to draw the stupa. So there's a beautiful Buddhist stupa in Santa Fe. It's way out of town. So, but if you're ever there, we were there drawing, and there's a garden, and I was there like, as a class field trip. But I felt just incredibly drawn to the place. So this was many years ago, and I just like kept going back. Like I would go to the bookstore, and I would go to like teachings and chantings that were like literally in Tibetan. So like this is like I wanted to go, and I wanted to be there, and I just started to read and study Buddhism, and have pursued that for 20 some years at this point now. So
And so that experience was give you a sense of place, a feeling like you had a place or a sense of peace, and
well,
it didn't have anything to do with the chaos around you. It was just that feeling that you got there.
I don't even know that it gave me a sense of peace. I don't think that that's the right way to describe it. I think it gave me like a hunger for more, a desire to go back. So as opposed to like a sensation of equanimity, like I was very, very drawn to it.
Hmm.
And then, got just immersed in the, study and practice of Buddhism in many different traditions and formats since then.
Hmm.
So
And what in that tradition, how do you connect up this heavy, sort of cognitive stuff that you do all the time in complexity science and neuroscience, and how do you connect up with with your feeling about about who you are and how you make sense, what's your purpose and how you make sense.
it's funny because I never really realized that like my pursuit of Buddhism, and also like my pursuit of neuroscience, and active inference now, like cognition, and kind of cognitive science, and how we study things, but really like there's a huge degree of convergence, and you'll see many books out there on Buddhism and neuroscience, and the effects of meditation on the brain, and regulation. It's like thought regulation is like possible, like neurofeedback, like there's all this stuff that you see, and it's not. I guess I always pursued both, for a deeper understanding of the brain and the mind. But as a scientist, like fundamentally, I'm a scientist. I'm driven by logic. I love to study. I'm hyper curious. So when you're going to investigate a thing, like anything, you need to understand that the tools that you're using for measurement and analysis, like you need to know what are the limits of the spectrophotometer, like the limits of absorption, and what wavelengths does it absorb. And so you need to understand the limits of the instrument that you're using to make your analysis. And the instrument that I'm using to make every single analysis every single day is my brain. And so like I can't, until I understand like my brain, my own cognitive processes, like through, whether it's through sitting meditation or through like actually studying the way that the brain works, like until we understand this, like how can we objectively understand or know anything? And so it's funny that like there's I've had this like huge degree of convergence in like my spiritual tradition and my like field of study, which I didn't plan on that, but that's
Hmm.
okay. Like I'm good with that. It's
Yeah. So
it's gelling. It's good.
is the Buddhism a pursuit of answers? Is it a compulsion or a pursuit, but just in a different form or a different mode?
Yeah, like definitely. I mean, the Buddhism is very much the study of the mind,
Right.
right? And study
The
study and
internal, the
training,
internal mind, not somebody else's mind, right? But your own mind.
right?
Yeah.
So it's very much that, and also it's a very it's not a faith based religion.
Mm-hmm.
Like, so it's investigate yourself and figure it out. Like, and where you kind of get some guidance, but mostly you just have to do the work.
Mm-hmm.
You have to investigate and see for yourself. And what do you think the answer is? Like, so it's a lot of it is kind of that way, as opposed to just like believe this because I say it's so. So it's kind of, there's no like prescription, like I mean, there's like the prescription given by Buddha, which is just like sit with it, right? But I mean, really, like you have to do the work.
Right. So one of the historical contrasts, at least in the West, has been between the presumptive scientific discipline and scientific approach to things, and then the revealed doctrine that's kind of implicit in many religions, including Christianity. And so this creates this tension that goes on there. And I think some practitioners will feel it too. They have this faith, and then they have this science, and it doesn't necessarily integrate that well. Do you feel like your scientific pursuit and your Buddhist spirituality pursuits are integrated or complementary?
Definitely. Like so it's like if you ascribe to the scientific method, right? Like Buddhism is like the scientific method for your spiritual life. Like I think about it like that. Like I don't see them as I don't see a lot of division there. Now there is a lot of division. Like there are a lot of scientific practices that like go against Buddhist principles, like research and killing and torturing animals, for example. So like definitely like there's a lot of muddy areas. Like there's a lot of gray space there. But I think as a practice, like practicing studying the brain and practicing, being a Buddhist is not, it's not that different.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it sounds like part of it is driven by curiosity, right? Both science and the spiritual practice you follow are let's get curious. Let's really delve into this and be open and be curious. Is that?
Yeah.
Yeah. And do you have any? Have you had any kind of things that flow from your spiritual practice that give you insights into something on the scientific side, or is it a kind of two different worlds?
So, like yes and no, in a like strange way, and in the way that like when I am studying and focusing and I'm reading and I'm trying to like digest 150 PDFs in 2 days or something like that, like just constantly putting in information, and really like there's not a lot of time to step back and like think about what I'm reading or what I'm studying. I think that my like meditation practice, but also just like sometimes taking a break to go for a walk or to take a shower, or like, I think back to like my grad school days, it was like just like hard. It was really like relentless, and really like in that peace, in that stillness, like that's where the coolest things bubble up. Mm-hmm. So whether that is in meditation or, in exercise or some other, but like when you make the room in your brain, like all the network connections can kind of solidify and gel. And then like you get out great ideas in that way.
I think that's probably a useful way of thinking about it, because it takes time for the processing and digesting and processing. Oh, the digesting is a biological metaphor. Processing is maybe a computer metaphor, but it takes time to have all of that information flow, sift, filter, coordinate. And after all, there are 100 billion neurons up there that have to get, each one has to take its place in the process. So it sounds like as one of from a practical standpoint, that, you can absorb information and, and absorb a lot of it, drink from the fire hose for a little while, but then you need that time for all of that stuff to do whatever it is doing to make sense of it all.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Well, that's a pretty interesting way of thinking about it. So that's from a sort of a methodological standpoint, but also from, if you're a scientist, you believe in the power of empirical science and investigation and, mathematical models and all of that good stuff, right? And active inference, that's sort of active inference, with a capital A, capital I, Um, so so that's that. Do you feel you have that? You know, is that commitment that you have to that methodology and science and that approach? Is that somehow a spiritual commitment?
You know, George, when you want to see things the way that they really are, like you just approach it from all the angles that are possible
Hmm.
to really kind of get there.
Hmm. Hmm.
Or maybe like there is no way things we really are, which is like kind of what I've been coming more and more to as I, maturing.
Hmm.
Like the way that things really are for me is it's never going to be the way things really are for you. Right. Like, so
Hmm.
we have some overlap of our quantum reference frames, some degree of shared truth or shared reality, some things we see similarly, but not everything.
Hmm.
So nobody can stand and see the world from the way I see it.
And that is partly from a Buddhist tradition of being able to see things that are, I don't want to say opposites, but just to hold things that have ambivalence, right? That don't necessarily have answers, or maybe the answer is yes and.
Yes, and
There we go.
it's from a Buddhist perspective, but it's also from the perspective of neuroscience. I mean, like when I'm looking at my sensors, I know that they're not the same as yours,
Hmm.
and the like we don't even know that like if we're looking at the color yellow that we see it the same way or that we have the same perception. I mean, people have different favorite colors, and
Hmm.
so the colors make everyone feel differently, and we just don't know. So there's no correct. I'm okay with not having. I'm okay with not having the answer.
Hmm.
That's okay with me. Like
Yeah,
I still like to try to figure it out. I'm still gonna try to
yeah.
pursue knowing.
Well, you get excited about the challenge of seeing something that you don't understand and trying to put it together. That's part of what you're doing. That's why you're in science in the first place, right? To make those puzzles work. Um, yeah. So I often ask my guests. I think you may already have answered this about uh, that sensation of a spiritual experience, a transcendent experience, something that happened to you that you can't really explain, but it really helped to shape your life. And I think you sort of already
Yeah,
gave that. Yeah.
yeah, you're
And,
good. I've
and
covered it.
yeah. And how I'm curious about, and you revisit, do you go back to the stupa?
I do occasionally. So I still have
Yeah.
some family in Santa Fe, and I mean, I have two small children, and so like I also am not going to take them into a stupa. So it's like getting up to Santa Fe, not having the kids. I would cruise by. I think it's probably been like 3 years ish since I've been by, but
Yeah.
yeah.
But does that place still hold that, kind of that precious specialness for you when you're there?
Santa Fe as a town, like, is so special to me. I mean, I dropped out of high school, like, was skipped 2 grades in school, and then just said, like, I'm done. Like, I'm not doing this. This is just dumb. And so I dropped out of high school and I got my GED and started art school in Santa Fe. And I
Hmm.
had been to like some rigorous academic, like hardcore, academic stressing. That was my entire school career, and so I was like, I just want to paint. Like, so just like Santa Fe, like I've never painted before. I'm like, I've no like natural artistic inclination, but I'm like, I'm in the desert, I'm just gonna paint because that's what it's cool to do out here, right? Or whatever, I don't know. So I started art school, went to art school in Santa Fe, and like no regrets. I mean, that whole time and experience, and it was like I was 16, so it's all just so like formative, right? So it's like the entire formative years of my like 16 to 21 I spent in Santa Fe, and maybe a little more than that, a little less, give or take. So just like I found myself, my life, my purpose. I went to art school. I always took math. I was always good at math, and I thought I was going to be an architect. And then we were sequencing the genome, and I was like, I like solving puzzles. I want to go solve that
Hmm.
one. And so, I mean, I just got into biochemistry, and like no regrets. Like everything kind of just flowed the way that it should. But definitely, like my experience being in Santa Fe, both in terms of like a scientific career, an artist, like a Buddhist. So like it was like a pivotal like angle for me, and like a very formative time in my life.
And perhaps it could have happened someplace else, but it happened there. right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
as did the complexity, as did my introduction to complexity.
Yeah.
So like I went back to Santa Fe and, had another pivotal transformative summer. So at the Santa Fe Institute, which
It
is,
almost makes you wonder if is there something special about the water or the mountains or.
Have you been?
I visited Santa Fe, but that was long before I knew what the Santa Fe Institute was. So, and it just reminds me of the comments I've heard from people familiar with the Celtic tradition about a thin place, right? It's a place where maybe for whatever reason, geological, magnetic, astronomical, whatever, it may be a place that just the boundaries are thinner between ways of perceiving. In this case, sort of a spiritual way of perceiving, a scientific way of perceiving. The boundaries get a little thinner, and it enables people. And people talk about what hallucinogenics do for some people in terms of thinning the boundaries and giving a sense of connection. But I'm definitely going to go back. I haven't had the opportunity in a while, but I'm going back virtually with talking with you and some others on the podcast and getting great inspiration and joy out of it.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Good.
So Bleu, thank you very much. This has been delightful. I really appreciate it. And we will sign off and talk to you again sometime.
Thanks, George. Take care.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of Making Sense of Complexity. We will be taking a short break, but we'll resume recordings in September. In the meantime, please explore the websites of our collaborators, Complexity Weekend, Planksip, and Talk of Today, and join the conversation on our social media outlets or on spiralinquiry.org. Stay well and have a great week.